Part 1. The 42nd floor of the Ashford Tower stood like a monument to human ambition, its glass walls reflecting the perpetual dance of Manhattan's skyline. Within its sterile confines, Alexander Ashford III commanded an empire that spanned continents. Yet his own heart remained as barren as the Arctic wasteland he had never visited, but somehow resembled in its cruel, unforgiving silence. 20 years had passed since laughter had escaped his lips. 20 years since the corners of his mouth had turned upward in anything resembling joy. The transformation had been gradual, like the slow erosion of stone beneath relentless rain. What had once been a man capable of warmth had crystallized into something harder, more unyielding, a creature of pure calculation and merciless efficiency. His office occupied the entire northeast corner of the building, a testament to his success and a fortress against human connection. The mahogany desk, imported from a forest in Brazil he owned but had never seen, stretched like an ocean between him and any who dared to enter his domain. Behind it, floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city he ruled from above, though Alexander rarely lifted his eyes from the endless stream of reports, contracts, and financial statements that demanded his attention. The morning of October 15th began like any other. Alexander arrived at precisely 6:30, as he had every weekday for the past decade. His driver, a silent man named Morrison, who had learned that conversation was neither welcome nor tolerated, deposited him at the building's private entrance with the mechanical precision of a well-oiled machine. The elevator whisked him to his floor in soundless efficiency, and by 6:45, Alexander was seated behind his desk, reviewing the overnight reports from his European offices. The numbers told stories of triumph and conquest. His latest acquisition, a struggling tech company in Silicon Valley, was already showing signs of the miraculous recovery that seemed to follow in his wake. 3,000 jobs saved, though Alexander gave little thought to the families behind those statistics. To him, they were merely variables in an equation, factors to be optimized for maximum profitability. His secretary of 5 years, Mrs. Pemberton, had given notice the previous Friday. A woman of advancing years and diminishing tolerance for his exacting standards, she had cited creative differences in her resignation letter, though Alexander suspected the truth was far simpler. She had grown weary of his relentless demands and Arctic demeanor. He felt neither sadness nor regret at her departure, emotions he had carefully excised from his repertoire like a surgeon removing diseased tissue. The replacement was to arrive at 8 o'clock sharp. Alexander had reviewed her credentials the night before, finding them adequate if unremarkable. Miss Eleanor Hartwell, 26 years of age, possessed a degree in business administration from a respectable but not prestigious university. Her previous employment had been with a mid-tier consulting firm, where her performance reviews praised her attention to detail and ability to work under pressure. These qualities, Alexander had concluded, would serve his purposes well enough. What the dry recitation of her qualifications had not prepared him for was the woman herself. At precisely 8 o'clock, a soft knock echoed through his office. Alexander glanced up from the quarterly projections he was reviewing, his expression neutral as granite. "Enter," he commanded, his voice carrying the authority of one accustomed to immediate obedience. The door opened with deliberate care, and Miss Eleanor Hartwell stepped into his domain. Alexander's first impression was one of understated elegance. She wore a charcoal grey suit that spoke of practicality rather than fashion, her dark hair pulled back in a style that was professional, yet somehow retained a touch of softness. But it was her eyes that gave him pause, a warm brown that seemed to hold depths he had no intention of exploring. "Good morning, Mr. Ashford," she said, her voice carrying a musical quality that seemed oddly out of place in the sterile environment of his office. "I'm Eleanor Hartwell. I believe you're expecting me." Alexander studied her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, noting the way she stood, straight-backed but not rigid, confident without being presumptuous. There was something in her manner, that suggested strength tempered by grace, a combination that was as rare as it was unnecessary for the position she was to fill. "Indeed," he replied, gesturing to the chair opposite his desk with the same enthusiasm one might show for indicating the location of a morgue. "Please be seated. We have much to discuss." Eleanor moved with fluid grace, settling into the leather chair as if it were a throne rather than a seat of judgment. She folded her hands in her lap and met his gaze without flinching, a feat that had caused lesser mortals to wither under his scrutiny. "I've reviewed your qualifications," Alexander continued, his tone as warm as a winter morning in Siberia. "They appear adequate for the position. However, I feel it necessary to establish certain expectations from the outset." "Of course," Eleanor replied, her voice maintaining its musical quality despite the obvious gravity of the moment. "I'm here to learn." Alexander leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled before him in a gesture that had become as automatic as breathing. "I require precision in all things, Miss Hartwell. When I request a document, I expect it to be flawless. When I schedule a meeting, I expect all parties to be prepared and punctual. When I give an instruction, I expect it to be followed without question or delay." "Understood," she replied, though something in her eyes suggested that complete submission was not in her nature. "I do not engage in small talk," Alexander continued, his gaze never wavering from her face. "I have no interest in your personal life, your weekend plans, or your opinions on matters unrelated to business. Our interaction will be strictly professional and limited to what is necessary for the efficient operation of this office." "I appreciate clarity in professional relationships," Eleanor said, though her tone carried a subtle undertone that Alexander couldn't quite decipher. "However, I do hope you'll find my work speaks for itself." "We shall see," he replied, rising from his chair with the fluid motion of a predator. He moved to a filing cabinet and withdrew a thick folder, placing it on the desk before her. "These are the Henderson contracts. They require review and summary by noon. I trust you'll find the work educational." Eleanor reached for the folder, her fingers brushing against his for the briefest of moments. The contact was electric, sending an unfamiliar jolt through Alexander's carefully controlled composure. He jerked his hand back as if burned, though his expression remained unchanged. "I'll have this completed well before noon," Eleanor said, seemingly unaffected by the momentary contact. She opened the folder and began scanning the documents within, her eyes moving with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to complex legal language. Alexander returned to his seat, though he found his attention wandering from his own work to observe his new secretary. There was something in the way she worked, a quiet concentration that seemed almost meditative. Her pen moved across the paper with elegant strokes, and occasionally she would pause, her brow furrowing slightly as she considered a particularly complex clause. The morning progressed with mechanical efficiency. Eleanor fielded phone calls with professional grace, her voice maintaining its musical quality even when dealing with the most difficult clients. She organized his schedule with an intuitive understanding of his preferences, somehow managing to create breathing room between meetings without him having to request it. By 11:30, she placed the completed Henderson summary on his desk. Alexander reviewed it with his characteristic thoroughness, searching for flaws that would justify the harsh critique he had prepared. Instead, he found work of remarkable quality, comprehensive, insightful, and presented with a clarity that made complex financial arrangements accessible even to those without his extensive background. "Satisfactory," he said, though the word barely captured his surprise at the document's excellence. Eleanor merely nodded, accepting the lukewarm praise without visible reaction. As the day progressed, Alexander became increasingly aware of Eleanor's presence in ways that disturbed his carefully maintained equilibrium. She moved through the outer office with quiet efficiency, her heels clicking a gentle rhythm against the marble floor. When she spoke on the telephone, her voice carried through the open door between their offices, creating a subtle soundtrack to his work that was neither intrusive nor entirely unwelcome. But it was during the lunch hour that his world shifted on its axis in a way he could never have anticipated. Alexander rarely left his office during the day, preferring to work through lunch while consuming the protein bars and vitamin supplements that comprised his utilitarian approach to nutrition. Eleanor, he assumed, would follow the example of her predecessors and disappear for exactly 60 minutes to consume whatever sustenance she preferred in the building's cafeteria or at one of the nearby establishments that catered to the office workers of Manhattan. Instead, she remained at her desk, unpacking what appeared to be a homemade lunch from an insulated bag. The sight struck him as oddly anachronistic. In an age of food delivery apps and gourmet takeout, she had chosen to prepare her own meal. Through the glass partition that separated their offices, he could see her arranging a sandwich, an apple, and what appeared to be a thermos of tea on her desk with the same careful attention she brought to her professional tasks. What happened next would haunt Alexander for years to come, though at the time he was merely puzzled by the unfamiliar sensations it awakened within him. Eleanor began to hum. The sound was soft at first, barely audible above the ambient noise of the city that filtered through the building's walls. But as she grew more comfortable in what she clearly believed to be her private moment, the humming evolved into something more substantial. Her voice, freed from the constraints of professional conversation, revealed its true nature, rich, warm, and possessed of a quality that seemed to resonate in the very air around her. Alexander found himself setting down his pen, his attention completely captured by the melody that flowed through the partition between them. It was nothing he recognized, not a popular song or classical piece, but something that seemed to spring from some deeper well of creativity. The tune was simple yet profound, carrying within it echoes of joy and sorrow, hope and longing, all woven together in a tapestry of sound that spoke directly to something in his chest that he had believed long dead. For 20 years, Alexander had lived in a world of silence. Oh, there had been sounds aplenty, the cacophony of traffic, the drone of air conditioning, the endless chatter of business conversations that held no more meaning than the static of a poorly tuned radio. But music, true music that spoke to the soul rather than merely occupying the ear, had been absent from his existence for so long that he had forgotten it was possible to be moved by melody. Now, listening to Eleanor's unconscious serenade, Alexander felt something stirring within him that he couldn't name and didn't dare acknowledge. His chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with the heart condition that ran in his family, and everything to do with an emotion he had spent 2 decades learning to suppress: the song, for it had evolved from humming into something fuller. Though Eleanor's voice remained soft enough that only he could hear it, seemed to tell a story without words. It spoke of mornings filled with possibility, of coffee shared with loved ones, of small moments of beauty that most people took for granted, but which Eleanor seemed to treasure like precious gems. Alexander rose from his chair without conscious thought, drawn to the window that offered a view of Eleanor's workspace. She sat with her back partially turned to him, her shoulders moving slightly with the rhythm of her song. Her dark hair caught the afternoon light streaming through the windows, revealing auburn highlights that hadn't been visible in the harsh fluorescent lighting of the morning interview. There was something in her posture, a relaxed grace that spoke of someone completely comfortable in her own skin, that struck Alexander as profoundly alien. He had spent so many years maintaining rigid control over every aspect of his presentation that the sight of someone so unself-consciously natural was both fascinating and deeply unsettling. The melody continued, weaving its way through the sterile air of the office like wildflowers growing through concrete. Alexander found his breathing had changed, becoming deeper and more rhythmic, as if his body was trying to match the cadence of Eleanor's song. His hands, which had been clenched into fists without his awareness, gradually relaxed as the music worked its inexplicable magic. For perhaps the first time in 20 years, Alexander Ashford III was not thinking about profit margins or market projections or the next acquisition that would add another zero to his already astronomical net worth. Instead, he was simply listening, allowing himself to be carried away by the pure, unadorned beauty of a human voice raised in unconscious joy. The song reached what seemed to be its natural conclusion, the melody resolving into a final, lingering note that seemed to hang in the air like morning mist. Eleanor fell silent, returning her attention to her modest lunch with the same unself-conscious grace that had characterized her song. Alexander remained frozen at his window, staring at this woman who had somehow, in the space of a single lunch hour, shattered 20 years of carefully constructed emotional armor with nothing more than a simple melody. He felt exposed, vulnerable in a way that was both terrifying and oddly exhilarating. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. For the first time in 2 decades, Alexander Ashford III wanted to smile. The impulse was so foreign, so unexpected, that he actually raised his hand to his face to confirm that his expression had not betrayed him. His fingers found the familiar terrain of controlled neutrality, the same mask he had worn for so long that it had become indistinguishable from his true face. But something had changed. Deep within the fortress of his chest, something that had been frozen for 20 years was beginning to thaw. The sensation was simultaneously wonderful and terrible, like the painful tingling that accompanies the return of circulation to a limb that has been numb for too long. Alexander returned to his desk with mechanical precision, though his ability to concentrate on the documents before him had been thoroughly compromised. His mind kept returning to the sound of Eleanor's voice, to the way the melody had seemed to unlock something within him that he had thought lost forever. The afternoon passed in a blur of meetings and conference calls, though Alexander found himself distracted in ways that would have been professional suicide if his reputation for ruthless competence hadn't been so firmly established. Twice he had to ask clients to repeat questions, and once he actually lost his train of thought mid-sentence during a presentation to the board of directors. But worse than the professional lapses was the growing awareness of Eleanor's presence in the outer office. Every time she moved, every time she spoke on the telephone, every time she simply existed in the space beyond his door, Alexander felt a pull unlike anything he had experienced in his adult life. By 5 o'clock, when Eleanor knocked softly on his door to inquire whether he needed anything else before she left for the day, Alexander had reached a state of internal turmoil that he was entirely unprepared to handle. "Come in," he said, his voice betraying none of the chaos that reigned within his chest. Eleanor entered with the same quiet confidence she had displayed throughout the day, a folder in her hand and that same warm expression in her brown eyes. "I've prepared tomorrow's schedule and placed the Morrison contracts in order of priority. Is there anything else you need before I go?" Alexander looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time since that morning's interview. The harsh fluorescent lighting couldn't diminish the warmth that seemed to emanate from her very being, the sense of life and vitality that had been absent from his world for so long that he had forgotten it was possible for another human being to possess such qualities. "No," he said, though the word came out rougher than he had intended. "That will be sufficient." Eleanor nodded, though something in her expression suggested she had noticed the change in his demeanor. "Have a good evening, Mr. Ashford." She turned to leave, and in that moment, watching her walk toward the door that would take her out of his presence and into her own life, a life about which he knew nothing but suddenly, desperately wanted to understand, Alexander did something that surprised them both. "Miss Hartwell!" he called out, his voice carrying an urgency that made her turn back with raised eyebrows. "Yes, Mr. Ashford." For a moment, Alexander stood frozen, trapped between the impulse to speak and the habits of 20 years that demanded silence. The words he wanted to say, questions about her music, compliments on her work, inquiries into her thoughts and dreams, and the source of the joy that seemed to flow through her like an underground spring, crowded against his teeth like prisoners demanding release. Instead, he said the only thing his professional persona would allow: "Your work today was exemplary. I expect the same level of performance going forward." Something flickered in Eleanor's eyes, disappointment perhaps, or maybe just recognition of the walls he had built around himself. "Of course, Mr. Ashford. I'll see you in the morning." And then she was gone, leaving Alexander alone in his fortress of glass and steel, surrounded by the trappings of his success, but feeling more isolated than he had in years. The silence that had once been his comfort now seemed oppressive, pressing against his eardrums like deep water. That night, for the first time in 20 years, Alexander Ashford III went to bed thinking not of market projections or hostile takeovers, but of a simple melody hummed by a woman with warm brown eyes who had somehow, in the span of a single day, reminded him that there was more to existence than the cold arithmetic of profit and loss. He did not smile, not yet. But somewhere in the frozen wasteland of his heart, the first green shoots of possibility were beginning to push through the permafrost of 20 years' solitude. The thaw had begun. Part 2. The following morning arrived with the inexorable precision of clockwork, yet Alexander found himself altered in ways both subtle and profound. He had awakened at his customary hour of 5:30, but the ritual of his morning routine, the precisely timed shower, the methodical selection of his charcoal suit, the consumption of his regulation breakfast of steel-cut oats and black coffee, felt somehow different, as though he were performing actions that belonged to someone else's life. The melody Eleanor had hummed the previous afternoon had haunted his dreams, weaving itself through the familiar landscape of his subconscious like a golden thread through dark tapestry. Even now, as Morrison's town car glided through the pre-dawn streets of Manhattan, Alexander found himself almost humming along to the remembered tune, catching himself just as his lips began to part. The realization that he had been on the verge of producing music, he who had not so much as whistled in 20 years, sent a shock through his system that was both thrilling and deeply unsettling. It was as though Eleanor's unconscious serenade had awakened something primal within him, some buried aspect of his nature that professional necessity had forced into hibernation. By 6:45, Alexander was seated behind his mahogany fortress, attempting to lose himself in the familiar comfort of financial projections and market analyses. The European offices had performed admirably overnight. The Tokyo branch had exceeded its quarterly targets, and a potential acquisition in South America was showing promise. These should have been sources of satisfaction, small victories in the endless campaign of corporate warfare that constituted his existence. Instead, Alexander found his attention wandering repeatedly to the empty outer office, to the desk where Eleanor would soon take her place and transform the sterile environment with her inexplicable warmth. The anticipation he felt at the prospect of her arrival was entirely foreign to him, a sensation he couldn't categorize or control. At precisely 8 o'clock, the soft click of the outer door announced Eleanor's arrival. Alexander's head lifted involuntarily from the documents he was reviewing, his entire being suddenly alert in a way that had nothing to do with business acumen and everything to do with an awareness he was reluctant to examine too closely. Through the glass partition that separated their offices, he watched Eleanor settle into her workspace with the same quiet efficiency she had displayed the day before. She wore a navy blue suit today, its conservative cut somehow failing to diminish the grace with which she moved. Her hair was styled differently, still professional, but with a few tendrils that had escaped their confinement to frame her face in a way that was both accidental and entirely captivating. "Good morning, Mr. Ashford." Eleanor's voice carried through the intercom system with that same musical quality that had so disturbed his equilibrium the previous day. "I've reviewed your schedule, and I notice you have a conference call with the London office at 9:30. Shall I prepare the quarterly reports for your review?" Alexander pressed the intercom button, his finger lingering on the device longer than was strictly necessary. "Yes," he replied, his voice betraying none of the strange anticipation that coursed through his veins. "And Miss Hartwell, please ensure the Pemberton files are properly archived. I want no trace of previous inefficiencies." There was a pause before Eleanor responded, and Alexander imagined he could hear the gentle smile in her voice. "Of course, Mr. Ashford. I'll see to it immediately." The morning progressed with mechanical precision, yet Alexander found himself increasingly aware of Eleanor's presence beyond his door. The soft percussion of her fingers on the keyboard created a subtle rhythm that seemed to underscore his own work, while her telephone conversations, always professional, always courteous, provided a gentle soundtrack to the harsh symphony of corporate life. It was during the London conference call that the first crack appeared in Alexander's carefully maintained facade. The discussion centered on a particularly complex merger, one that required his full attention and considerable diplomatic skill to navigate the competing interests of multiple parties. Yet, as he listened to the disembodied voices crackling through the speakerphone, his attention kept drifting to the outer office, where Eleanor was methodically working through the Pemberton archives with the same careful attention she brought to all her tasks. "Alexander, are you still with us?" The voice of James Whitmore, his London representative, cut through his distraction with the sharpness of a blade. "Naturally," Alexander replied, though he had missed the previous 2 minutes of conversation entirely. "Please, continue with your analysis of the third quarter projections." He managed to navigate the remainder of the call through careful questioning and strategic silence, but the lapse in concentration was deeply troubling. For 20 years, Alexander had prided himself on his ability to compartmentalize, to focus his considerable intellect on the matter at hand without distraction. The fact that a single employee, one he had known for barely 24 hours, could so thoroughly disrupt his professional equilibrium was both fascinating and terrifying. The call concluded at 10:15, leaving Alexander with a brief window of time before his next appointment. Rather than immediately diving into the next stack of documents that demanded his attention, he found himself rising from his chair and moving to the window that offered a view of Eleanor's workspace. She was humming again. The realization struck him with the force of revelation. It wasn't a conscious performance or a deliberate act of rebellion against the sterile corporate environment. It was simply her nature, as natural and unconsidered as breathing. The melody was different from the previous day's song, this one carrying a more contemplative quality, as though she were working through some complex emotional equation in the language of music. Alexander pressed closer to the glass, his breath fogging the surface as he strained to hear every note. There was something in this new song that spoke to him even more directly than the first, a quality of yearning that resonated with emotions he had thought permanently buried beneath 20 years of professional detachment. As he watched, Eleanor paused in her archival work and reached for her coffee cup, a simple ceramic mug that looked handmade, its glaze a warm blue-green that seemed to capture and hold the office lighting like trapped sunlight. She lifted it to her lips with both hands, cradling it as though it was something precious, and in that moment Alexander was struck by the profound intimacy of the gesture. Here was someone who found pleasure in simple things, who could transform the mundane act of drinking coffee into something approaching ritual. The realization that such people still existed in the world, that Eleanor existed in the world, and more impossibly, in his world, sent a tremor through Alexander's carefully constructed reality. The humming continued as Eleanor returned to her work, her voice weaving through the melody with an unconscious artistry that made Alexander's chest tighten in ways he couldn't name. He found himself leaning against the glass partition, his forehead nearly touching its cool surface, as completely absorbed in her unconscious performance as he had ever been in the most crucial business negotiation. It was in this compromised position that Eleanor chose to glance up from her work. Their eyes met through the glass with an impact that was almost physical. Alexander saw surprise flicker across Eleanor's features, followed quickly by something that might have been understanding. For a moment that stretched into eternity, they simply looked at each other. He, the powerful CEO, caught in an act of inexplicable voyeurism. She, the secretary who had somehow shattered 20 years of emotional isolation with nothing more than her natural warmth and unconscious music. Alexander should have stepped back, should have returned to his desk with the cold dignity that had served him so well throughout his adult life. Instead, he found himself frozen in place, caught between the desire to retreat into familiar professional distance and an entirely new impulse to somehow bridge the gap that separated them. Eleanor's response surprised him. Rather than looking away in embarrassment or confusion, she smiled, not the careful professional expression he had expected, but something warmer and more genuine. It was a smile that acknowledged what had just passed between them, without judgment or discomfort. A smile that seemed to say she understood something about him that he didn't yet understand about himself. Then, with deliberate care, Eleanor placed her coffee cup on her desk and returned to her humming, this time making no effort to keep her voice low or private. The melody filled the space between their offices, transforming the sterile corporate environment into something altogether more human. Alexander remained at the window, no longer attempting to hide his attention. There was something in Eleanor's smile, in her decision to continue singing despite his observation, that seemed to grant him permission to listen without shame. For the first time in decades, he allowed himself to be truly present in a moment that had nothing to do with profit or acquisition or the endless accumulation of power. The song Eleanor hummed seemed to tell a story without words, a story of resilience and hope, of finding beauty in unexpected places, of the courage required to remain open to joy in a world that often seemed designed to crush such tender impulses. As Alexander listened, he found himself remembering things he had thought permanently lost. The sound of his mother's laughter before the cancer took her, the feeling of sand between his toes during a childhood vacation to the Hamptons, the simple pleasure of a book read for entertainment rather than information. These memories, buried beneath 20 years of willful emotional suppression, rose to the surface like air bubbles in deep water, each one carrying with it a bittersweet pang of recognition. Alexander had spent so long defining himself by what he had achieved that he had forgotten entirely who he had been before achievement became his sole purpose. The intercom on his desk buzzed, jolting Alexander back to the present with the force of cold water. Eleanor's voice, now returned to its professional cadence, announced his next appointment. "Mr. Ashford, Mr. Richardson from the accounting firm is here for your 10:30 meeting." Alexander straightened, his hand moving automatically to adjust his tie, a gesture so habitual it required no conscious thought. Yet something had fundamentally shifted in the brief interval of Eleanor's song. The armor of professional detachment that had protected him for 2 decades felt suddenly ill-fitting, as though he had outgrown it in the space of a single melody. "Send him in," Alexander replied, his voice carrying its customary authority despite the emotional upheaval that roiled beneath the surface. Richardson proved to be everything Alexander remembered. Meticulous, thorough, and possessed of the particular brand of creative accounting that had made him invaluable to Ashford Industries' more delicate financial maneuvers. Under normal circumstances, Alexander would have found their discussion of tax optimization strategies and offshore holdings both stimulating and profitable. Today, however, he found himself distracted by the awareness of Eleanor's presence in the outer office. Even with his door closed and Richardson's voice filling the space between them, Alexander could sense her moving about her work, could almost hear the echo of her humming in the building's ambient noise. "The Cayman Islands structure could save us upwards of 40 million annually," Richardson was saying, his pale eyes bright with the fervor of a man who found genuine pleasure in financial complexity. Of course, it would require some creative interpretation of the recent regulatory changes, but nothing that couldn't be justified, if questioned. Alexander murmured, his attention wandering despite the astronomical sums under discussion. Through his peripheral vision, he could see Eleanor moving past his door, her silhouette visible through the frosted glass. The sight sent an entirely inappropriate warmth through his chest, a sensation so foreign that he briefly wondered if he was experiencing some sort of cardiac episode. "Alexander?" Richardson's voice carried a note of concern. "You seem distracted today. Perhaps we should reschedule if you're not feeling well." The suggestion that he might be anything less than completely focused snapped Alexander's attention back to the matter at hand. "Nonsense," he replied, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. "Please continue with your analysis of the European holdings." They concluded their business in another 45 minutes, with Alexander approving several financial maneuvers that would have required his complete attention under normal circumstances. Instead, he found himself signing documents and authorizing transfers, while some entirely different part of his consciousness remained attuned to Eleanor's movements in the outer office. As Richardson departed with his briefcase full of signed authorizations, Alexander was left alone with the growing realization that something fundamental had shifted in the bedrock of his existence. The carefully ordered world he had constructed, a world where emotion was weakness and human connection was merely another tool to be leveraged for profit, was showing cracks that widened with each passing hour. The remainder of the morning passed in a blur of meetings and conference calls, though Alexander's performance was markedly below his usual standards. Twice he found himself agreeing to terms he would normally have negotiated more aggressively, and once he actually complimented a client's presentation, an act of unprovoked humanity that left the man stammering in surprised gratitude. It was during the lunch hour that Alexander's transformation took its next significant step. As had become his custom, he remained in his office while Eleanor presumably took her break, consuming his regulation protein bar and reviewing the afternoon's appointments. The routine had served him well for years, providing uninterrupted time to process information and prepare for the challenges that lay ahead. Today, however, the silence felt oppressive rather than productive. The absence of Eleanor's presence, her humming, her gentle movements, the simple fact of her existence in the space beyond his door, created a void that Alexander found surprisingly difficult to bear. When Eleanor's humming resumed at precisely 1 o'clock, Alexander felt a sensation that could only be described as relief. The melody was different again, this one carrying a lilting quality that spoke of contentment and quiet joy. It was the sort of song one might hum while walking through a garden in spring or while preparing a meal for someone loved. Without conscious decision, Alexander found himself rising from his chair and moving toward the door that connected his office to Eleanor's workspace. His hand hovered over the handle for a long moment, trembling slightly with the magnitude of what he was contemplating. To open that door would be to cross a line he had maintained for 20 years. It would be to acknowledge that Eleanor's presence had become something more than merely professional, that her unconscious music had awakened needs and desires he had thought permanently buried. Yet even as his rational mind catalogued the reasons why such a gesture would be inappropriate, unprofessional, and potentially catastrophic to the carefully maintained order of his existence, Alexander found his hand turning the handle. The door opened with a soft click, and Eleanor looked up from her desk with surprise that quickly transformed into something warmer. Her humming ceased, but the smile that crossed her features was worth the loss of music. "Mr. Ashford," she said, rising gracefully from her chair, "did you need something?" For a moment, Alexander stood frozen in the doorway, caught between the safe familiarity of his office and the dangerous territory of human connection that lay beyond. Eleanor waited patiently, her brown eyes warm, with an understanding that seemed to encompass more than the simple question she had asked. Alexander began, then stopped, appalled by the uncertainty in his own voice. 20 years of commanding boardrooms and intimidating competitors had not prepared him for this moment, for standing before a woman whose only weapon was kindness and finding himself completely disarmed. Eleanor tilted her head slightly, the gesture so unconsciously graceful that Alexander felt his carefully constructed defenses crumble a little further. "Would you like some tea?" she asked, her voice gentle. "I was just about to make a cup." The offer was so simple, so completely divorced from the complex power dynamics that governed every other interaction in Alexander's life, that he found himself nodding before his conscious mind could intervene. "That would be acceptable," he managed, though the words emerged rougher than he had intended. Eleanor's smile brightened, transforming her features in a way that made Alexander's chest tighten with something that felt dangerously close to happiness. "Please, have a seat," she said, gesturing to one of the chairs positioned in front of her desk. "I'll just be a moment." Alexander found himself obeying. He, who had grown accustomed to having his every wish anticipated and fulfilled by others, was following the gentle instructions of his own secretary. The role reversal should have been intolerable. Yet as he settled into the chair Eleanor had indicated, Alexander discovered that submission to her kindness was not the weakness he had expected, but rather a strange sort of liberation. As Eleanor moved about the small alcove where she kept her personal items, Alexander observed her with the fascination of an anthropologist studying an entirely foreign culture. She filled an electric kettle with water from a small bottle, selected tea bags from a wooden box that looked handcrafted, and arranged 2 cups with the same careful attention she brought to her professional duties. "Do you prefer sugar or honey?" Eleanor asked, glancing over her shoulder with that same warm smile. Alexander paused, realizing he had no idea what he preferred. His usual caffeine consumption consisted entirely of black coffee, consumed for its stimulant properties rather than any consideration of taste or pleasure. "I'm not certain," he admitted, the confession feeling strangely intimate. "Honey, then," Eleanor decided with gentle authority. "It's much better for you than refined sugar, and it adds a lovely floral note to chamomile." As she spoke, Eleanor continued her tea preparations with an unconscious grace that was mesmerizing to watch. Alexander found himself studying the elegant line of her neck as she bent over the cups, the way afternoon sunlight caught the auburn highlights in her dark hair, the delicate strength of her hands as they performed their simple ritual. "There," Eleanor said, turning back to him with 2 steaming cups. "It needs to steep for a few minutes, but it should be perfect shortly." Oh, she settled into the chair beside his, not behind her desk, Alexander noted, but beside him, as though they were equals rather than employer and employee. The proximity was both thrilling and terrifying, bringing with it an awareness of Eleanor's warmth, the subtle scent of her perfume, the soft sound of her breathing. "You have beautiful offices," Eleanor said, her gaze wandering around the space with genuine appreciation. "The view must be spectacular from your window." Alexander followed her gaze, seeing his domain through her eyes for the first time in years. The expensive furnishings, the carefully curated artwork, the symbols of power and success that had once filled him with satisfaction now seemed somehow hollow, lacking the simple warmth that Eleanor brought to even this brief interaction. "It serves its purpose," he replied, then found himself adding, "though I confess I rarely take time to appreciate the view." Eleanor looked at him with something that might have been sympathy. "That's a shame," she said softly. "Beauty is everywhere, if we just remember to look for it." The words hung in the air between them, carrying depths of meaning that Alexander wasn't sure he was ready to explore. Yet as he met Eleanor's warm brown eyes, he found himself wondering when he had stopped looking for beauty, when his world had narrowed to encompass only profit margins and acquisition targets. "The tea should be ready now," Eleanor said, lifting her cup to her lips and taking a delicate sip. "Perfect," she murmured, and the simple pleasure in her voice sent an unexpected warmth through Alexander's chest. He lifted his own cup with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly, bringing it to his lips with the caution of a man approaching an entirely foreign experience. The tea was indeed perfect, warm, fragrant, with a complexity of flavor that spoke of Eleanor's care in its preparation. But more than the taste was the experience of sharing this simple ritual with another human being, of sitting in companionable silence while afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows and transformed their corner of the corporate world into something approaching sanctuary. For 20 years, Alexander had believed that power and isolation were synonymous, that true strength required the complete suppression of human need and vulnerability. Now, sitting beside Eleanor in the warm circle of her unconscious kindness, he began to suspect that perhaps the greatest strength of all lay in the courage to allow oneself to be known. Part 3. The sharing of tea marked a turning point in Alexander's carefully ordered existence, though he would not fully comprehend the magnitude of this shift until much later. In the days that followed their impromptu afternoon ritual, he found himself anticipating Eleanor's presence with an intensity that bordered on the obsessive, while simultaneously fighting against the implications of his growing dependency on her unconscious grace. Each morning brought with it a familiar routine transformed by unfamiliar expectation. Alexander continued to arrive at his customary hour, continued to review the overnight reports from his global empire with his characteristic thoroughness. Yet beneath the surface of professional competence ran an undercurrent of anticipation that was entirely foreign to his nature. Eleanor's punctual arrival at 8 o'clock had become the true beginning of Alexander's day, though he would never have admitted such weakness aloud. The soft click of the outer door, the gentle rustle of her settling into her workspace, the warm cadence of her voice as she greeted him through the intercom, these sounds had somehow become as essential to his well-being as the morning coffee that fueled his corporate machinations. But it was Eleanor's music that truly held him captive. Each day brought a new melody, hummed with the unconscious artistry that marked all her gestures. Sometimes the songs were contemplative, threading through the office air like morning mist. Other times they carried an underlying joy that seemed to transform the very molecules of the corporate atmosphere. Alexander found himself learning to read Eleanor's moods through her music, developing an intuitive understanding of her emotional landscape that was both thrilling and deeply unsettling. The third week of Eleanor's employment brought with it a crisis that would test the fragile détente Alexander had established between his professional obligations and his growing personal obsession. The Singapore office had discovered irregularities in their quarterly projections, irregularities that could potentially cost Ashford Industries hundreds of millions of dollars if not addressed with immediate and decisive action. Under normal circumstances, Alexander would have descended upon the situation with the merciless efficiency that had built his empire, wielding fear and intimidation like surgical instruments to extract the truth and eliminate the problem. Instead, he found himself distracted by Eleanor's absence from her desk as she attended to various administrative duties throughout the building. The video conference with Singapore was scheduled for 2 in the afternoon, a time that corresponded to early morning in that distant city when the responsible parties would be fresh and alert and therefore more likely to provide useful information. Alexander had spent the morning reviewing financial reports and preparing what should have been a devastating interrogation of his overseas managers. Yet as the hour approached, he found his attention wandering repeatedly to the empty outer office, to the silence where Eleanor's humming should have been providing its gentle soundtrack to his work. Her absence created a void that seemed to suck the energy from his normally formidable concentration, leaving him feeling unmoored and strangely vulnerable. At precisely 2 o'clock, the wall-mounted screen in Alexander's office flickered to life, revealing the haggard faces of his Singapore management team. David Chen, the regional director, looked as though he hadn't slept in days, while his financial officer, Sarah Kim, kept glancing nervously at documents spread across the conference table before her. "Gentlemen, Ms. Kim," Alexander began, his voice carrying the Arctic chill that had intimidated lesser mortals for 2 decades. "I trust you have explanations for the rather disturbing discrepancies that have come to my attention." The next 30 minutes should have been a masterclass in corporate intimidation. Alexander had perfected the art of verbal dissection, the ability to reduce grown men and women to stammering incompetence through the surgical application of carefully chosen words. He had built his reputation on such moments, establishing himself as a force of nature who brooked no incompetence and showed no mercy to those who failed to meet his exacting standards. Instead, the conference call devolved into something approaching chaos. Alexander found his attention split between the explanations and excuses flowing from the screen and the awareness of Eleanor's continued absence from her desk. Twice, he lost the thread of the conversation entirely, requiring subordinates to repeat crucial information while he struggled to focus on matters that should have commanded his complete attention. "Sir," David Chen was saying, his voice tight with stress, "the irregularities appear to stem from a software glitch in our accounting system. We've identified the source of the problem and believe we can have it corrected within 48 hours. Alexander should have demanded immediate action, should have threatened consequences that would have left his Singapore team working around the clock to resolve the crisis. Instead, he found himself nodding absently, his mind occupied with questions that had nothing to do with accounting software or quarterly projections. Where was Eleanor? What administrative tasks had called her away from her desk? When would she return to restore the sense of order and comfort that had somehow become essential to his functioning? "That seems reasonable," Alexander heard himself saying, the words emerging without conscious volition. "Keep me informed of your progress." The Singapore team exchanged glances of barely concealed surprise. Alexander Ashford III, the man who had once fired an entire department for missing a deadline by 6 hours, was accepting their excuses with something approaching benevolence. Had they known the true source of his distraction, their surprise might have transformed into something approaching awe. The call concluded with far less drama than anyone had anticipated, leaving Alexander alone in his office to confront the disturbing realization that his legendary focus was no longer entirely his own to command. The admission was both terrifying and strangely liberating, like the first crack in a dam that had held back floodwaters for too long. It was in this state of emotional upheaval that Eleanor chose to return from her administrative duties, her arrival announced by the familiar click of the outer door and the soft percussion of her heels against the marble floor. Alexander felt his entire being relax in ways he hadn't realized were possible, as though Eleanor's presence provided some essential element that had been missing from his carefully climate-controlled environment. Through the glass partition, he watched Eleanor settle back into her workspace with that same unconscious grace that characterized all her movements. She had changed her clothes during her absence. The navy suit of the morning had been replaced by a charcoal dress that complemented her coloring while maintaining perfect professional appropriateness. Yet there was something in the way she moved, a subtle loosening in her posture that suggested the administrative duties had taken her outside the building's sterile confines into the more chaotic world beyond. As if sensing his observation, Eleanor glanced up from the papers she was organizing and offered him a smile that seemed to carry with it hints of fresh air and sunlight. The expression was so warm, so entirely without artifice, that Alexander felt something in his chest respond with an intensity that was almost painful. "Mr. Ashford," Eleanor's voice came through the intercom with its familiar musical quality. "I hope your conference call went well. I have the Morrison contracts ready for your review, and Mr. Patterson from the legal department would like to schedule a meeting regarding the Henderson acquisition." The mention of business matters should have snapped Alexander's attention back to the corporate priorities that had governed his existence for 20 years. Instead, he found himself pressing the intercom button and saying something that surprised them both. "Miss Hartwell, would you step into my office for a moment? There are several matters I'd like to discuss." And the request was not unusual in itself. Countless secretaries had been summoned to his office for countless discussions of business minutiae. What was unusual was the tremor of uncertainty in Alexander's voice, the suggestion that perhaps the matters he wished to discuss had very little to do with contracts or acquisitions. Eleanor appeared in his doorway with her customary promptness, a notepad in her hand, and that same warm expression in her brown eyes. She had learned to read his moods with an accuracy that was both impressive and slightly unnerving, adapting her demeanor to match his needs in ways that seemed to require no conscious effort on her part. "Please, sit," Alexander said, gesturing to the chair opposite his desk with a hand that trembled almost imperceptibly. Eleanor settled into the leather seat with fluid grace, her attention focused on him with an intensity that made him suddenly aware of his own breathing. For a long moment, Alexander struggled to find words for the thoughts and feelings that had been building within him like pressure in a sealed vessel. The corporate vocabulary that had served him so well in every other aspect of his existence seemed entirely inadequate for the emotional territory he was attempting to navigate. "The Singapore matter," he began, then paused, realizing that business concerns were not truly what had prompted him to summon Eleanor to his presence. "That is to say, your administrative duties this afternoon. I trust they were completed satisfactorily." Eleanor's eyebrows rose slightly at the question. In 20 years of commanding corporate minions, Alexander had never inquired about the successful completion of routine administrative tasks. Such duties were expected to be handled with competence and discretion, requiring no acknowledgement or discussion unless they failed to meet his exacting standards. "Yes, Mr. Ashford," Eleanor replied, though her tone suggested she was aware that something deeper lay beneath his seemingly innocuous inquiry. "I was coordinating with the building management regarding the renovation of the conference facilities on the 38th floor. Everything has been arranged according to your specifications." Alexander nodded, though his mind was already moving beyond the mundane details of conference room renovations to more troubling questions about why Eleanor's temporary absence had affected him so profoundly. The realization that he had become dependent on her presence, not just for her professional competence, but for the simple fact of her existence in his carefully ordered world, was both humbling and terrifying. "I see," he said, then found himself adding, "I trust the building management was cooperative." The question was so far removed from Alexander's normal concerns that Eleanor actually smiled, an expression of genuine amusement that transformed her features in ways that made his chest tighten with unfamiliar warmth. "Quite cooperative," she replied, her voice carrying a hint of laughter, "though I suspect they were more impressed by the Ashford name than by my powers of persuasion. It was a small joke, delivered with the gentle self-deprecation that marked many of Eleanor's observations, yet it struck Alexander with unexpected force. Here was someone who understood the weight his name carried in the corporate world, yet seemed entirely unaffected by the intimidation and deference it typically inspired. Eleanor treated him not as the feared and powerful Alexander Ashford III, but simply as a man who might benefit from her kindness and consideration. "Your powers of persuasion," Alexander heard himself saying, "are considerably more formidable than you realize." The words emerged before his rational mind could intervene, carrying with them implications that hung in the air between them like morning mist. Eleanor's eyes widened slightly, and Alexander saw something flicker across her features, surprise perhaps, or recognition of the shift that was occurring in their carefully maintained professional relationship. "Mr. Ashford," Eleanor said softly, her voice carrying a gentleness that seemed to encompass understanding beyond her years. "Is everything quite all right? You seem different today." The observation was delivered without judgment or intrusion. Yet it struck Alexander with the force of revelation. Eleanor had noticed the changes that he had been fighting to suppress, had recognized the cracks that were appearing in his carefully maintained facade of professional detachment. Alexander began, then stopped, appalled by his own inability to complete a simple sentence. 20 years of commanding boardrooms and intimidating competitors had not prepared him for the vulnerability of being truly seen by another human being. Eleanor waited patiently, her brown eyes warm with compassion that made Alexander's defenses crumble a little further. There was something in her manner that suggested she would wait as long as necessary for him to find the words he needed, that she possessed reserves of patience and understanding that were as deep as they were genuine. "You hum," Alexander said finally, the words emerging rough and uncertain. "While you work, you hum. It's distracting." Eleanor's eyebrows rose again, and Alexander saw a faint blush color her cheeks. "I'm so sorry," she said quickly, her voice filled with mortification. "I had no idea it was audible from your office. I'll be more careful to—" "No!" Alexander interrupted, the word emerging with surprising vehemence. Eleanor fell silent, her eyes wide with surprise at his reaction. "That is to say," he continued more quietly, "I don't wish you to stop." The confession hung in the air between them, carrying with it the weight of 20 years' emotional suppression. Alexander had revealed more of himself in those few words than he had to any human being since his transformation into the feared CEO of Ashford Industries. Eleanor studied his face with an intensity that was both penetrating and surprisingly gentle. Whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy some internal calculation, for her expression softened into something approaching tenderness. "I've always been a singer," Eleanor said quietly, her voice carrying a vulnerability that matched his own. "My grandmother taught me that music was a way of keeping the heart open, even in the darkest times. I suppose it's become such a habit that I barely notice when I'm doing it." Alexander felt something in his chest respond to her words with an intensity that was almost physical. The image of Eleanor as a child, learning songs from her grandmother, receiving wisdom about keeping the heart open, it painted a picture of a life lived in such stark contrast to his own that he felt momentarily dizzy with the implications. "Your grandmother," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "was she a wise woman?" Eleanor smiled, and in that expression, Alexander saw depths of memory and affection that spoke to experiences he had never allowed himself. "Very wise," she replied. "She used to say that music was the language the heart spoke when words weren't enough." The observation struck Alexander with devastating accuracy. For 20 years, he had lived in a world where words were weapons, where communication served only the purposes of negotiation and intimidation. The idea that there might be another language, one that spoke to deeper truths and more authentic needs, was both foreign and desperately appealing. "And you believe this?" Alexander asked, leaning forward slightly in his chair. "That music can communicate what words cannot?" Eleanor nodded, her expression growing thoughtful. "I think music reaches parts of us that we sometimes forget exist. It reminds us that we're more than just our professional roles, more than just the masks we wear for the world." The words hit Alexander like physical blows, each one finding its target in the fortress of his carefully constructed identity. Eleanor was describing precisely what her unconscious singing had been doing to him, reaching parts of himself that he had buried beneath 20 years of corporate achievement, reminding him of depths he had forgotten he possessed. "You speak," Alexander said slowly, "as though you believe I wear such a mask." It was a dangerous question, one that invited Eleanor to see past the professional facade he had spent decades perfecting. Yet even as his rational mind recoiled from the vulnerability it represented, some deeper part of him desperately wanted her answer. Eleanor regarded him with that same gentle intensity, her brown eyes seeming to look past the expensive suit and intimidating reputation to something more essential beneath. When she spoke, her voice carried a compassion that was almost overwhelming in its sincerity. "I think," she said carefully, "that everyone wears masks sometimes. The question is whether we remember what lies beneath them." Alexander felt his breath catch at the gentle accuracy of her observation. Eleanor had somehow intuited the central tragedy of his existence, that he had become so thoroughly identified with his professional persona that he had nearly forgotten the man who lay beneath it. "And if one has forgotten," he asked, his voice barely audible, If the mask has been worn so long that it has become indistinguishable from the face beneath. Eleanor's expression grew even more tender, and Alexander saw something in her eyes that might have been grief for the man he had buried beneath 20 years of corporate success. "Then perhaps," she said softly, "it's time to learn to remember." The words settled into the space between them like seeds in fertile ground, carrying with them possibilities that were both terrifying and infinitely precious. Alexander found himself staring into Eleanor's warm brown eyes, seeing reflected there not the feared CEO of Ashford Industries, but someone far more vulnerable and human. For the first time in 20 years, Alexander Ashford III found himself genuinely curious about who he might be beneath the armor he had so carefully constructed. The prospect was terrifying in its implications, yet as he sat in the warm circle of Eleanor's understanding, he began to suspect that perhaps the risk of rediscovering himself might be worth whatever dangers it entailed. Outside his office windows, the afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the Manhattan skyline, painting the corporate landscape in shades of gold and amber. But inside the fortress of glass and steel that had been his domain for so long, Alexander was beginning to glimpse the possibility of a different sort of illumination, one that had nothing to do with the harsh fluorescent lighting of corporate success and everything to do with the gentle warmth that seemed to emanate from the remarkable woman who sat across from his desk, offering him a chance at redemption he had never dared to imagine. DM Part 4. The weeks that followed Eleanor's gentle challenge marked a period of transformation so profound that Alexander barely recognized the man he was becoming. The corporate machinery of Ashford Industries continued to function with its customary efficiency. Mergers were completed, profits were maximized, and his empire expanded across continents with the relentless precision that had made him one of the most feared figures in international business. Yet beneath the surface of professional competence, a quiet revolution was taking place, one measured not in quarterly earnings, but in the gradual thawing of a heart that had been frozen for 20 years. Eleanor's presence had become the gravitational center around which Alexander's existence revolved, though he was careful to maintain the professional facade that protected them both from corporate gossip and potential scandal. She continued to arrive each morning at precisely 8 o'clock, continued to manage his schedule with meticulous efficiency, continued to field his calls and correspondence with the grace that had marked her performance from the very beginning. But now, Alexander found himself listening not just to her words, but to the music that accompanied her work, the unconscious melodies that flowed from her lips like a constant stream of joy. He'd learned to distinguish between her various songs, understanding that the contemplative ballads indicated deep thought, while the livelier tunes suggested satisfaction with completed tasks. The gentle lullabies that emerged during quiet moments spoke to a nurturing nature that extended far beyond her professional duties, encompassing an understanding of human need that was both profound and entirely natural. It was on a Tuesday in late November that the next significant crack appeared in Alexander's carefully constructed emotional armor. The morning had begun like any other, with Alexander reviewing overnight reports while Eleanor settled into her workspace beyond the glass partition. The familiar rhythm of her presence had become so essential to his functioning that he no longer questioned the peace it brought to his previously chaotic inner landscape. The disruption came in the form of a phone call that would have been routine under normal circumstances. Eleanor's voice, when it came through the intercom, carried an unusual note of strain that immediately commanded Alexander's attention. "Mr. Ashford," she said, her normally musical tone flattened by obvious distress, "I have Mrs. Patterson from St. Mary's Hospital on line 2. She says it's regarding your mother's estate. Something about final arrangements that require your immediate attention." Alexander felt his blood turn to ice at the mention of his mother. Though Margaret Ashford had been dead for 15 years, the estate had been settled long ago. the funeral arrangements completed with the same mechanical efficiency he brought to all unpleasant necessities. What could possibly require his attention now? "Put her through," Alexander commanded, his voice carrying the Arctic chill that had intimidated lesser mortals for 2 decades. The conversation that followed lasted only 7 minutes, yet it shattered the carefully maintained equilibrium of Alexander's emotional landscape with devastating efficiency. Mrs. Patterson, it transpired, was not calling about his mother's estate at all. She was a volunteer coordinator at St. Mary's Pediatric Ward, and she had been given Alexander's name by a mutual acquaintance who suggested he might be interested in their upcoming Christmas charity drive. "We're hoping to provide presents for the children who will be spending the holidays in our care," Mrs. Patterson explained, her voice bright with the particular brand of determined optimism that marked career philanthropists. "Many of these children have been with us for months, fighting battles that would challenge the strongest adults. A small gift, a moment of joy. These things can make such a difference in their recovery." Under normal circumstances, Alexander would have terminated such a call within 30 seconds. His charitable giving was handled by a foundation that provided him with tax benefits while maintaining the emotional distance he required. The idea of personal involvement in philanthropic endeavors was as foreign to his nature as voluntary poverty. Yet, as Mrs. Patterson continued her explanation, describing children who faced uncertain futures with courage that humbled their adult caregivers, Alexander found himself thinking not of tax implications or corporate image management, but of Eleanor's gentle wisdom about keeping the heart open even in the darkest times. "I'll consider your request," Alexander heard himself saying, the words emerging without conscious volition. "Please send the relevant information to my office." The call concluded with Mrs. Patterson's effusive gratitude ringing in his ears, leaving Alexander alone with the disturbing realization that something fundamental had shifted in his approach to human suffering. Where once he had seen only statistical abstractions, the unfortunate casualties of an imperfect world, he now found himself imagining individual faces, specific stories of courage and hope that demanded more than financial detachment. It was Eleanor's gentle knock on his door that drew him back from these unsettling contemplations. She entered his office with her customary grace, though Alexander could see traces of concern in her warm brown eyes. "Is everything all right?" Eleanor asked, settling into the chair across from his desk with the natural ease that had come to characterize their interactions. "You looked rather affected by that phone call." Alexander studied Eleanor's face, seeing in her expression the same genuine concern that had marked all her interactions with him. Here was someone who cared about his well-being, not because of his wealth or power, but simply because she possessed a capacity for compassion that extended to all human beings within her sphere of influence. "Mrs. Patterson," Alexander said slowly, "was soliciting donations for hospitalized children, Christmas presents for those who will spend the holidays fighting for their lives." Eleanor's expression softened with immediate understanding. "That must be heartbreaking work," she said quietly. "Those volunteers see so much suffering, yet they continue to believe that small acts of kindness can make a difference." "And you?" Alexander asked, leaning forward slightly in his chair. "Do you share their belief in the power of small kindnesses?" Eleanor smiled, and in that expression Alexander saw the same wisdom her grandmother had apparently possessed, the understanding that hope was not naive optimism, but rather a conscious choice to believe in the possibility of good despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. "I think," Eleanor said carefully, "that kindness is like music. It reaches places that logic and efficiency cannot touch. It reminds us that we're connected to each other in ways that transcend our professional roles or social positions." Alexander felt something in his chest respond to her words with an intensity that was almost painful. Eleanor was describing precisely what her presence had done for him, created connections that transcended the corporate hierarchy that had defined his relationships for 20 years. "The children," Alexander said, his voice barely above a whisper, "they have no one to provide these gifts." "Some do," Eleanor replied, her voice gentle with understanding. "But others, their families may be struggling financially or geographically distant, or sometimes absent altogether. For those children, the kindness of strangers becomes their only source of holiday joy." The image of children facing illness and isolation without the comfort of family presence struck Alexander with devastating force. He thought of his own childhood, privileged and protected, where Christmas had meant elaborate celebrations and gifts beyond counting. The contrast with these young patients, fighting for their lives while surrounded by the sterile environment of medical necessity, was almost overwhelming. "What would such gifts entail?" Alexander asked, surprised by his own interest in the practical details of charity work. Eleanor's eyes brightened with something that might have been hope. "Usually simple things," she explained. "Books, art supplies, stuffed animals, items that provide comfort and distraction during long days of treatment. The volunteers try to match gifts to individual interests when possible." Alexander nodded slowly, his mind already working through the logistics of what he was contemplating. The Ashford Foundation could certainly provide funding for such an endeavor, but something in Eleanor's description suggested that personal involvement might be more meaningful than mere financial contribution. "Would you?" Alexander began, then paused, appalled by the vulnerability implied in what he was about to ask. "That is to say, would you be willing to assist me in selecting appropriate gifts? I find myself inexperienced in such matters." Eleanor's smile could have illuminated the entire Manhattan skyline. "I would be honored," she said, her voice warm with genuine pleasure. "There's a wonderful toy store just a few blocks from here. They specialize in educational and therapeutic toys for children of all ages." The prospect of venturing into the world beyond his office, into the realm of toy stores and gift selection, should have filled Alexander with dread. Instead, he found himself anticipating the expedition with something approaching excitement, though he was careful not to examine too closely the source of this unexpected enthusiasm. "Very well," Alexander said, attempting to maintain some semblance of professional composure. "We shall undertake this mission tomorrow afternoon. I trust you can arrange the necessary scheduling adjustments." "Of course," Eleanor replied, though her tone suggested she was aware that something significant had just transpired between them. "I'll coordinate with the hospital to obtain a list of the children's ages and interests." As Eleanor rose to leave his office, Alexander found himself seized by an impulse that was entirely foreign to his nature. "Miss Hartwell," he called out, his voice carrying an urgency that made her turn back with raised eyebrows. "Yes, Mr. Ashford?" For a moment, Alexander struggled with words that seemed inadequate to express the gratitude he felt, not just for her willingness to assist with the charitable endeavor, but for the gradual transformation she had wrought in his understanding of what it meant to be human. "Thank you," he said finally, the simple words carrying depths of meaning that neither of them could have imagined when she first entered his employ. Eleanor's smile in response was like sunrise after the longest night, warm and full of promise for whatever lay ahead. The following afternoon found Alexander in the most unlikely location of his adult life, a toy store in Midtown Manhattan, surrounded by the cheerful chaos of children's merchandise and the gentle guidance of a woman who was teaching him to see the world through entirely new eyes. Eleanor moved through the store with the confidence of someone who understood the mysterious preferences of young people, selecting books that would transport young minds to distant worlds, art supplies that would provide creative outlets during long recovery periods, and stuffed animals that would offer comfort during the darkest hours of medical treatment. Alexander followed in her wake, carrying packages with the same attention he normally devoted to corporate acquisitions, yet finding in this simple act of service a satisfaction that surpassed anything his business achievements had ever provided. Watching Eleanor explain the therapeutic benefits of various toys to confused sales clerks, seeing her face light up as she discovered the perfect gift for a particular child, Alexander felt something in his chest that took him several moments to identify. He was happy. The realization struck him with the force of revelation. So foreign was the sensation after 20 years of emotional numbness. Alexander Ashford III, the feared CEO who had built his reputation on ruthless efficiency and calculating detachment, was experiencing genuine joy in the simple act of selecting Christmas presents for children he had never met. "This one," Eleanor said, holding up a music box decorated with dancing figures, "is perfect for Maria. She's 8 years old and loves ballet, though her treatments have made it impossible for her to dance herself." Alexander took the delicate toy from Eleanor's hands, winding the mechanism and watching the tiny figures spin to a melody that was hauntingly beautiful in its simplicity. The music reminded him of Eleanor's unconscious humming, carrying the same quality of hope and joy that had first begun to thaw his frozen heart. "It's beautiful," he said, surprised by the roughness in his own voice. "She'll treasure it." Eleanor nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears that spoke to the depth of her compassion for children she had never met, but whose suffering she felt as keenly as if it were her own. They spent 3 hours in that toy store, selecting gifts with the care that Alexander normally reserved for multi-million-dollar business deals. Each choice was considered not just for its immediate appeal, but for its potential to provide comfort, inspiration, or simple joy to a young person facing challenges that would have broken many adults. As they loaded their purchases into Alexander's car, Eleanor hummed softly, a new melody that seemed to capture the satisfaction of a meaningful task completed with love and attention. Alexander found himself listening to her song with the same intensity he had once devoted to financial projections, recognizing in its gentle rhythms the sound of his own transformation. The delivery to St. Mary's Hospital took place the following morning, with Alexander and Eleanor arriving at the pediatric ward like unlikely angels, bearing gifts that would transform the holiday season for dozens of young patients. The gratitude of the nursing staff was overwhelming, their tears of appreciation creating an emotional atmosphere that Alexander found both foreign and deeply moving. It was Mrs. Patterson who provided the moment that would complete Alexander's transformation. As they prepared to leave the hospital, she approached him with a young girl who appeared to be no more than 6 years old, her head wrapped in colorful scarves that couldn't quite disguise the absence of hair beneath. "Mr. Ashford, Mrs. Patterson said, her voice warm with gratitude. "This is Sophie. She wanted to thank you personally for the art supplies you provided." Sophie looked up at Alexander with eyes that held wisdom far beyond her years, yet still sparkled with the resilience that seemed to characterize the young patients they had encountered. In her small hands, she held a drawing that she had apparently created with the very supplies they had delivered. "I made this for you," Sophie said, her voice carrying the particular brand of directness that marked conversations with children. "It's a picture of happiness." Alexander knelt to examine Sophie's artwork, his throat tightening as he recognized what she had created. The drawing showed 2 figures, one tall and dark, the other smaller with flowing hair, standing together in what appeared to be a garden filled with flowers and musical notes. Above them, a sun smiled down with rays that seemed to dance across the page. "It's beautiful, Sophie," Alexander managed, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you." Sophie smiled, and in that expression, Alexander saw the same uncomplicated joy that had characterized Eleanor's presence in his life, the ability to find light even in the darkest circumstances, to create beauty from whatever materials were available. As they left the hospital, Alexander carried Sophie's drawing with the reverence normally reserved for priceless artifacts. Eleanor walked beside him in companionable silence, her presence providing the steady warmth that had become as essential to his well-being as breathing itself. It was not until they were seated in his car, surrounded by the mundane noise of Manhattan traffic, that Alexander felt the final wall of his emotional fortress crumble entirely. "Eleanor," he said, his voice carrying a tremor that spoke to depths of feeling he was only beginning to understand. "I need to tell you something." Eleanor turned to face him, her brown eyes warm with the patient attention that had become so precious to him over the months of their association. "For 20 years, Alexander continued, his voice growing stronger as he found words for truths he had never dared to acknowledge, "I believed that strength meant isolation, that success required the complete suppression of human feeling. I built an empire on that foundation, accumulated wealth beyond imagination, achieved everything that our society teaches us to desire." Eleanor listened without interruption, her expression growing more tender as she recognized the magnitude of what he was attempting to share. "But you," Alexander said, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that was both terrifying and liberating, "you showed me that true strength lies not in emotional armor, but in the courage to remain open to beauty, to joy, to the simple human connections that make life worth living." Alexander paused, gathering courage for the words that would complete his transformation from the man he had been to the man he was becoming. "Your music, your kindness, your unconscious grace, these things reached parts of me that I had thought permanently dead. You reminded me that beneath the corporate facade, beneath 20 years of carefully constructed detachment, there was still a man capable of feeling, of caring, of finding joy in simple moments of human connection." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears that spoke to her understanding of what his confession meant, not just as words, but as a complete revolution in his understanding of what it meant to be alive. "And you," Alexander said, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried the weight of absolute truth, "you make me want to smile." The admission hung in the air between them like a bridge spanning 20 years of emotional wasteland. Alexander felt exposed and vulnerable, yet somehow more complete than he had ever been in his carefully protected existence. Eleanor's response came not in words, but in action. She reached across the space that separated them and took his hand in hers, her touch warm and gentle and entirely without demand. In that simple gesture, Alexander felt the last of his defenses dissolve, leaving him open to possibilities he had never dared to imagine. "Alexander," Eleanor said softly, using his first name for the first time since entering his employ, "I think your smile would be beautiful." And in that moment, surrounded by the chaos of Manhattan traffic and the memory of a 6-year-old's drawing of happiness, Alexander Ashford III did something he hadn't done in 20 years. He smiled. The expression began slowly, uncertainly, as though his facial muscles had forgotten how to arrange themselves in configurations of joy. But as Eleanor's own smile answered his, as he felt the warmth of human connection flowing between them like music made visible, Alexander's smile grew into something radiant and transformative. It was not the calculated expression of professional courtesy or the cold satisfaction of a successful business transaction. It was the genuine smile of a man who had finally remembered what it meant to be human, who had found in the warmth of another person's presence the courage to embrace emotions he had spent decades learning to suppress. Eleanor's laughter rang through the car like bells, a sound of pure joy that seemed to celebrate not just his smile, but the long journey that had brought them both to this moment of perfect understanding. Alexander found himself laughing too, the sound rusty and uncertain at first, but growing stronger as he rediscovered the simple pleasure of shared happiness. As their laughter subsided into the comfortable silence that marks the deepest forms of human connection, Alexander understood that his life had been permanently altered. The corporate empire would continue to function. The business deals would still require his attention, but now these activities would be balanced by something infinitely more precious: the knowledge that he was capable of love and worthy of being loved in return. Outside the car windows, the sun was setting over Manhattan, painting the corporate landscape in shades of gold and rose. But inside Alexander's heart, a different sort of illumination was taking place, the warm glow of a man who had finally learned that the greatest success of all lay not in the accumulation of wealth or power, but in the simple courage to keep his heart open to the possibility of joy. Eleanor's presence beside him, her hand still warm in his, was proof that miracles could happen even in the most unlikely circumstances. A song hummed by a secretary had broken 20 years of silence, and in learning to smile again, Alexander had discovered that the most profound transformations often came not through grand gestures, but through the gentle persistence of love.